All right, so I'm just going to start the session. The first monthly seminar of 2024 for GEO LDN. How to define minimum quality standards for elements of the LDN Toolbox. An incredibly niche topic, but also a very valuable and important one. I'd like to remind you all that this session will be recorded, and we will be posting it online for anyone who cannot show up to the session. So if you do not want to be recorded, please do leave the session now or possibly turn off your cameras. You can always ask questions in the chat if you're not comfortable talking on camera. Welcome. So just some housekeeping rules. If you have a question, please use the chat box for the moderator to note it down. We will monitor the chat box while Alastair is talking. However, during the Q&A, we are more than happy for people to ask questions live, especially as we know sometimes not everyone has access to the chat box. Please do mute your microphone while others are speaking in order not to interrupt or cause any noise problems. Do raise your hand when you want to speak, otherwise we might have people speaking at the same time and then we can't hear anybody. And if possible, please switch on your camera during the Q&A session because we would love to see your lovely faces, and I'll make a reminder about that then. Today, we will have the exemplary Alastair Graham talking to us about how to define minimum quality standards for elements of the LDN Toolbox. However, first we will have Bernd Eversmann, a member of the GEO LDN Secretariat, telling us why this was such an important aspect for GEO LDN to focus on and the results, some of the results or some of the work that has been done, some of the background. So I will hand it over now to my colleague Bernd to continue on.
Thank you very much, Lena. Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. My name is Bernd Eversmann. I'm an advisor for Earth observation in the GEO LDN Secretariat, so working together with Lena and a few other colleagues. And you may have heard me in one of the previous seminars. Yeah, next slide, please. I'll keep it really short so that we have most of the time for the presentation by Alastair. So when we talk about the GEO LDN toolbox, we had mentioned that before. We see it as a box of interoperable software tools and standards, interfaces, methods, which link the huge amount of geospatial data which is out there to the people who actually need those data sets. So to make visible what is there already, to reuse and improve, and to lead to a situation where more and more planners and decision makers are able to make use of Earth observation data. And so the topic of today fits very well into this toolbox idea. And I think that's enough already for an introduction. And I would like the next slide, please, to introduce Alastair. Yeah, Alastair, thank you very much for being here. It's really a pleasure to have you. Alastair is a geographer and geospatial data analyst with a PhD in remote sensing, and I could do a long introduction. I think you have owned a geospatial analytics company. You have done lots of consulting work in the area. You have run a podcast on the topic for a few years, and I think your work is always centered around topics touching the planetary boundaries, the use of resources, and so on. Tell me, how and when did you first get in touch with the GEO LDN initiative?
So this would have been in 2019. So there was a call put out for some work around minimum data standards linked to the sub-indicators of 15.3.1. And I guess that was probably the first time that I'd really come across GEO LDN as a group. I was aware of the SDGs and some of the work that was happening there, but it was really as a consequence of that call, and then the fact that I won the work to look at creating minimum data standards and some workflows around that I started to get really interested in two aspects, actually: the technical aspect of what you're trying to do in the LDN community, but also the community aspect, where I was really impressed and heartened by the fact that so many people from all around the world are trying to work towards the same goal, and everybody is able to have a voice and to have an opinion and put that into developing the methods. So yeah, that was when I first came across it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and one more question. The work you did at that time around or regarding the minimum quality standards and decision trees for SDG 1531, how do you see the connection to the work you did now for elements of the LDN Toolbox?
I think that this work that I'm about to talk about today is really a continuation of the types of work that I was doing previously. The one thing that was obvious to me when I did the previous work was that there's already a large number of methods and data and ideas within the community. And the point of that work was to try and create a series of workflows to get to minimum data standards to allow different types of software and methodologies to use a core data set of data, so that they could all be sort of interoperable. And then I guess with the work that I'm about to talk about, it's a continuation of that, where we're trying to understand how you can have trust in the tools that it is that are using those data. And by having a minimum set of standards, it means that you at least have a base layer that everybody can aspire to and attain, hopefully, in order to get into the toolbox. And then from there, you can build on different aspects to sort of make a core set of tools around a core set of data, so you have trust in the process.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for giving us a bit of that context and the connection. So thank you once more for being here today, and for your presentation to of how to define minimum quality standards for elements of the LDN Toolbox. And the floor is yours. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Brilliant, thank you. I will hopefully share my window like I did this morning.
Yes, I'm sure it'll all go great.
Are you able to see the slides?
Looking fantastic.
Brilliant. Okay, excellent. Yes, so thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about the piece of work that I did at the back end of 2023 for GEO LDN, which, as Brenda said, was looking at how to define minimum quality standards for elements of the toolbox, the LDN toolbox, sort of as a way of being able to process how a tool is able to get included into the toolbox, but also if you're a user, so that you can understand the different levels maybe of what tools can do within the toolbox itself. Maybe just to start off, although we've talked a little bit about who I am, I'm an independent researcher and consultant based in Bristol in the UK. My background is in Earth observation and energy and geospatial analysis. So I've been doing environmental applications for Earth observation for about 25 years now. And certainly in the last 15 or so, I've been almost exclusively using open source and open data as my sort of first stop. And then, as was been mentioned, in 2019, I won that contract to look at data standards. So throughout a large chunk of 2020, I was working with GEO LDN and UNCCD, working on minimum data standards against the different sub-indicators. I'm sure this audience all knows what GEO LDN is, but I just wanted to put a quick slide in case anyone who's watching on the recording isn't quite sure. But effectively, It's a stakeholder-driven initiative, and it's responding to a request by the UNCCD to try and bring together Earth observation data providers and governments. And then I think the really key bit is to develop minimum data quality standards, analytical tools, and capacity building. And I guess my previous work was looking at the minimum data quality standards, and this piece of work is looking at the analytical tools in a bit more detail, with the overall purpose of trying to strengthen land degradation monitoring and reporting, specifically using remote sensing and in situ data as well. And then maybe a little bit as well about what the GEO LDN Toolbox is. So initially I put this picture of a box of spanners as a bit of a joke, thinking that I'd be able to say, it's not really a box of spanners, but actually thinking about it, it probably is quite a good analogy in that there's a whole raft of different types of tool that are within the LDN Toolbox. So the GEO LDN Toolbox is really seen as an entry point for different types of analytical tools, but also data sets and methods that all work to try and look at land use planning and moving towards land degradation neutrality. The workflow of the toolbox is structured around the typical 5 phases of an integrated land use planning cycle. And I think that the thing to stress is that it's not just software, that there's quite a lot of methodological and other tool types as well. And I think hopefully once we get on to discussing the types of standards, minimum standards that I've been working on, we'll be able to see that although there's a focus on software, it's those standards should not just be specific to software products. And then the question then arises as to, well, why do we need toolbox standards? As Bernd has already said, the driver for the work is interoperability. And in particular, that means the ability of systems to provide data and information and services to try and make sure that they are operating effectively, both together and with other tools. And it's having some form of standard that interoperable systems can adhere to really helps, because it enables them and the operational processes to exchange data, exchange information, both between different components of an individual system, but between different systems as well. And what I think is most important is, at the end of this quote you can see on the screen from the Wellcome Trust, is being able to look at digital research outputs, which are sort of a digital object in their own right, and making sure that you're able to find them, making sure that they're accessible, making sure that they talk to one another, and making sure that components of them, if not the entire tool or methodology, are reusable in different situations. And I think that's really one of the key drivers around why we've been looking in this piece of work, in particular, at how we can try and understand what it is that each of the different tools do within the toolbox, without having to describe each of the different tools at any given time. So if we're talking about interoperability, it's probably best to discuss some of the principles of interoperability and how you can test for them. So there's a list here which I've taken as a sort of first starter in terms of how I was trying to think about how we might approach the problem of looking at a series of standards for the GEO LDN Toolbox. And really what we're looking to do is trying to identify the different components to be tested, which is relatively simple because that's a list of current components within the toolbox, or a future list of components that want to be added into the into the toolbox. We also need to identify what each component does or is supposed to do. And again, that's relatively easy. There's a description with most of the tools, certainly the ones that are in there, as to what they do. And it's, as we'll see later when we go through the minimum standards, being able to have that description is a sort of core need for any future tool as well. Then we also need to try and identify the different expected inputs and outputs across the system. This is a little bit more tricky to do, but again, I reached out to some of the more major tools that are in the current toolbox. I had discussions with people who are related to those and tried to understand what the inputs and outputs might be for their tool and try and understand how they might link back to the core data that we've been talking about from the minimum data standards work, and how some of the outputs might help in defining how you can map land degradation. Then you also need to identify the information that needs to be shared or moved, and it might be a relatively small amount of information, or in some cases it might be a large set of core data or information that needs to be moved. And then you also want to try and test for the expected behavior of the components. And again, this comes down in large part at this point to discussing with people who are heavily involved with each of the tools to understand what it is that we're expecting from their individual tool. And then finally, which hopefully this webinar is a part of, but also the information that I've sent to GEO LDN, there's a need to document the testing procedure to make sure that if someone else wants to come in and either amend it or understand what's been going on, they can do that. So the UN SDGs actually created a guide for interoperability, which was really useful. It addresses data standards, it addresses issues around metadata, and what's quite interesting is that it also calls for common language frameworks. So being able to describe complex problems like you get in LDN by using terminologies that everybody understands is a real key component of making sure that interoperability happens across different systems, especially when, as is the case with GEO LDN, you're actually encouraging individual groups of people and researchers to create their own tools. Being able to come back to that common language and common standards around metadata and data really helps. So the GEO LDN requirement was to look at the software and the other tools within the toolbox, and to try and be as broad as possible so that we could be inclusive, but also try and have that minimum quality requirement. And I think these 4 bullet points sort of explain what was trying to happen with the piece of work that I'm going to go into in a bit more detail. We were trying to nudge projects that were creating tools to get to a certain sort of minimum quality standard point, rather than stating that you have to get to a certain level. We were trying to be as flexible as possible with the different ideas around what a minimum quality standard might be, in order to try and create some form of conformity amongst all the different tools, but also being mindful that there's a huge diversity of tooling and ideas that are coming towards GEO LDN for inclusion in the toolbox. And that leads on in some respects to that 3rd bullet point, which is to allow all comers with suitable tools, and then to try and be sort of looking towards the future and understanding where will things be in 12, 18, 24 months, and what will be the tooling and the methods that are most relevant then, and how can we help sort of develop alongside what's coming in the sort of near future, to make sure that everything is fit for purpose. So faced with the fact that the GEO LDN Toolbox already has a set of tools within it, and that there are new groups bringing tools to GEO LDN for inclusion in it, the first thing I wanted to be able to do was find some form of method that would not only capture the information from the tools that already exist, but also be flexible enough to allow new tools to come in and meet the same sorts of standards that were already being met, hopefully, by the tools that are already included. And one of the things I've always been quite impressed by is in the open source geospatial world, there's a group called OSGeo, and they have a series of projects that get submitted as ideas, that get submitted to OSGeo core, and then they quite often work with the project groups to incubate them through into a core OSGeo project. And the way that they do that is through what you can see in this sort of target-based image on the screen. So they look at 3 core areas. One is social, one is technical, and one is fair. And then within each of those, they have different themes. And within each of those themes, they have specific targets that these projects need to meet. And if they meet enough of the different targets, then that project can become accepted into OSGeo as a core project. And the idea of that, I think, resonated with me in terms of what we're trying to do with the GEO LDN Toolbox as well. So hopefully, what I explained in the next few slides will be able to, in your head, will be able to be related back to this type of diagram. It's not the exact same themes, but the idea is there in that what we want to do is incubate tools into the toolbox, but make sure that certain criteria are met, so that all of the tools have the same sort of baseline. So I'm going to go through each of the different standards, and there are a fair number, so some of them I will go through in more detail than others. Of the different categories that we saw in that first diagram, if I just swap back, so we have social, fair, and technical. I took those 3 categories and added another one, which was overview. Because through discussion with people who are already quite advanced in terms of their tool development and use of the tool, it was thought that there needed to be a couple of minimum standards that just explained the purpose of why your tool should be included into the toolbox. So these 2 purpose minimum standards are sort of key. You have to meet both of these in order for your tool to be to move on to the next stage of going through the process of understanding whether it meets the minimum standards. So the first one is that the tool or the software or the component of the software or the algorithm being assessed for entry into the toolbox has been developed in order to address issues around LDN, which again, that seems like a standard idea for having a good purpose for the tool that you're trying to get into the toolbox. And then the second one was that the tool can demonstrate that it has a user base. And part of the idea around that second minimum standard was because in discussions with various people, it came out that you might have a tool that you think is wonderful yourself, but if only you and a couple of other people use it, then it's not really something that should be added to a toolbox that is sort of trying to capture a global set of analysts in order to use that tool. So I guess what it means is that an organization like GEO LDN, if this second minimum standard isn't met for a given tool, can then maybe suggest different ways in which you might grow the user base of your tool. So moving on to the next set of standards within the theme, the technical theme. There's a lot of text on this slide, and so what I've tried to do is just highlight in the red box the two minimum standards, and then given an overview in the 3 lines of red text below of what the next 3 preferred standards are. And I'll talk about what minimum standards and preferred standards are and how they differ. So in the technical section, what we wanted as minimum standards, or proposed minimum standards, are that the user documentation is accessible or online, ideally both, but users need to be able to understand the specifics of how to use the tool or the methodology that you're trying to submit into the toolbox. And then the next one was that the written language of the documentation should be in one or more of the 6 official languages of the UN. We had quite a few discussions with people whilst developing this minimum standard about whether or not it needed to be the 6 official languages of the UN, whether or not there should be other languages that are included. And in the end, the proposed minimum standard is that if the UN is taken as the sort of oversight body, then I guess the official languages that are used by the UN would be good enough as a minimum for the different languages that documentation should be potentially in. So it's not saying that the documentation has to be in all 6, it needs to be in one of the 6. As you can then see, there's 3 preferred standards. So these are areas where it was thought that there should be some consideration towards trying to create a minimum standard, but the process that we're trying to do in order to incubate tools into the toolbox should not be so rigid as to state that they have to be met. So it would be preferred that there were some form of instruction on how to translate the documentation, and it would be preferred that there was some form of how-to user guide that was available, and that can be in whatever format the tool project wanted that to be. And it should also be preferred that there is some form of technical documentation around the tool. And again, there's some suggestions that are made in the preferred standard as to what that technical documentation might be, but at the moment there's no specified minimum standard as to what that technical documentation can be. It just is preferred that there is something that explains the technicalities. Staying with the technical side of things, then there's a further 2 minimum standards, one around code. So this is where we want the code to be as self-explanatory as possible. So it should either be commented or self-documenting, which is a specific way of writing code, to a sufficient degree that those with reasonable technical skills around different types of code are able to understand what it is that the tool is doing. And obviously this only applies if it's a software tool. And then the second one around data is that the tool acknowledges or implements the minimum data standards that are on the GEO LDN website, and that I mentioned I was involved in for the previous piece of work back in 2020. The idea here is that there's been a whole raft of work around standards for data And if it meets the minimum data standards, then the tool is at least acknowledging that the GEO LDN process and the LDN process is being followed for reasons of clarity and keeping everything within the standards that have been currently agreed. And then there's two data preferred standards. One is on providing access to the default data. And again, we don't want to explain in too much detail about what access might mean. It could just be links through to a website where people can find the data, or it could be, if it's a software tool, there's an API that pulls in the data directly. We're not going to be the ones that specify what that is, but ideally there would be some form of access. And then the other preferred standard is that if there's any other data that is used, then open data formats are used in order to share and make available those data. And again, that's a reasonably common data standard, I guess, within this community. A lot of the data is open and being shared anyway. And so the hope would be that that preferred standard would be easily met for any tool that's looking to go into the toolbox. And then finally, there's a preferred standard around having a release plan. And all that's needed there is that some form of pathway to explain how the tool might be released, whether that's a series of documents around methodologies or whether it's a software tool, that can get described and then published with the tool as well. So the final set of technical standards are around metadata and security, and there's a lot less text on this slide, so I will try and go through these in a bit more detail. So in terms of the metadata, there's a minimum standard and a preferred standard. I think the minimum standard is that the tool should have some form of easily accessible and easily readable metadata. And metadata describes not just the data that's being used in the tool, but also some of the functionality of the tool as well. And in preference, that metadata that's supplied with the tool would be linked to or would follow some known standard, so that the metadata could get shared about an individual tool without having to share the tool itself or other descriptive information about the tool. You should be able to just share the metadata and people be able to pick up what that tool is about. And then in terms of security, there's a minimum standard that ideally you wouldn't require any personal data for a given tool. And this came from a series of discussions with tool developers about whether or not, in particular with software, to be honest, whether or not you need to capture information about people to create individual accounts in order to use the software, and then how long you might want to keep that data around an account, and all the other associated things with account management. So we were trying to think of different ways as we were having these conversations that we could create minimum standards around this. And the easiest thing to do is just say, well, ideally, you wouldn't require any personal data. And this, I think, works across different types of tooling. So whether it's software or whether it's sort of methodologies or not, because anything that's not software, then ideally you shouldn't be asking for personal data anyway for downloading of that or anything like that. And then in terms of preferred standards, if you do have to ask for personal data, then it needs to be deleted as soon as it isn't required. And then linked to that as well, there should be a personal data policy about how it's handled and when it's deleted, and that policy should be viewable by the person who's having to create the account in order to use your tool. So the next category was fair, and what we've done here is, again, for code, we've tried to set a minimum standard that makes sure the code itself is accessible, or the methods document, if that's what it is that's being proposed to go into the toolbox, is accessible and is held in a public online repository. So I know there's lots of opinions about whether or not GitHub is a sufficiently fair and open public online repository, but it's a common one that's used. So that would be something that hits this minimum standard. Then again, if you wanted to take your code sharing to a higher level, you might choose a different type of repository that's also publicly available, but maybe hits higher standards in terms of how it handles the code internally and stuff like that. And then there was a couple of preferred standards around software sustainability as well. And what we were trying to understand in terms of software sustainability was how many people would be able to pick up any given software tool and either develop it further or understand it and help support it. And in order to do that, these two preferred standards came out. So one is that the software tool itself should be written in a well-known and well-supported computer programming language, which helps more people have access through into the code and be able to have an input if they want to, rather than having it written in something that's too esoteric and unknown. And then also, ideally, you would, in order for a tool to be sustainable over the long term, you'd want a core development team, whether that's in software or in terms of methods. You want the core development team of that tool to include a sufficient number of people who can develop the tool, but also help pass on to, say, the next generation who are going to be developing iterations on that tool. So ideally, you'd want to have a reasonably sized development team, and we're not proposing what that size should be. That's up to the tool team itself to decide that. But hopefully, through discussions within the core team itself and with GEO LDN, then it would become obvious as to whether or not you had a sustainable tool.
Alastair, sorry to interrupt briefly.
Yes.
We're eating into our discussion time now. In order to have some time left at the end, could you wrap up in the next 4 or 5 minutes?
Yes, sure.
And we have some time left for discussion. Thanks.
Okay, cool. So also in terms of the proposed standards, so in terms of fairness, we had a series of 3 preferred standards here. One was to have a guide as to how new developers or researchers can get involved in the tool, and that should be open and available to all. We also were looking at how other people might be able to participate in developing the tool. So one is to have some form of feedback mechanism and to encourage feedback on the tool, and also to encourage development of the tool from members who are outside the core development team. So trying to understand different ideas and take those ideas into the tool. I will then just quickly go through the social standards as well. So we had 2 minimum standards. One was that the license should be an open license, whether that's for code or for documentation. And then also that the documentation and the tool should include a method of contact so that new users or developers who are coming into the tool and the project can ask for help. And there were also a couple of preferred standards linked to that as well. There's a very so the idea was to create a demonstrator tool as well in order to show how different tools fitted into those different minimum standards. And I wanted to take an idea that we have in the UK around something called EPCs, which is an energy performance certificate that you get for your house if you're selling your house. And it tells you where the house is currently in terms of energy efficiency and where it could go, and then gives you an idea of what you can do to change that. And it might be that you have something similar in your country as well. So I created a tool which currently is a spreadsheet, but ideally would be developed into something that was a bit more robust, where people can add in, so they're told what whether it's a minimum standard or a preferred standard, the target to achieve, and are given some notes to explain what they might want to try and hit in order to get that target achieved. They can then respond in the circle with whether or not the standard is met, and they need to give some evidence as well, so that someone at GEO LDN can look at this and understand whether or not the standard has actually been met. And then the output from that is hopefully something similar to the EPC. So you get an overall score. So this is for MapX, where their overall score was 226. It breaks down the score against the maximum score available on the right-hand side, and they get an A rating, and all the standards have been met, so they can be added in or remain in the toolbox. Similarly for WOCAT apps, they get a score and a breakdown as well, and they are also an A-rated tool. So the idea is that this is a first step, and in my eyes, a proposal to GEO LDN as to what the standards, the minimum standards might be for getting things into the toolbox. Some ideas about possible next steps have been to look at ideas around deployment and scalability, how people can access this, so whether it should be on mobile phones, how many people could access at any one time, that sort of thing, and are the tools robust enough to do that and therefore be allowed into the toolbox. And then finally also how you would disseminate geospatial information, so possibly looking at compliance around other standards such as the OGC services, and how that would link directly into the minimum standards for the GEO LDN toolbox. Yes, apologies for overrunning slightly, but thank you very much.